Good evening, all, and a warm welcome from my side. I hope that you are keeping warm throughout this winter evenings, and thank you so much for joining. I'm Professor Jeanette Maritz, and I will be facilitating the session this evening. Our topic for this evening is developing and the presentation of your master's dissertation or your doctoral thesis. And in essence, it's about understanding your chapter development and the requirements of these chapters. We will be sharing the videos or the PowerPoint presentations with you after the session. I know sometimes there's, you say that the print is maybe too small, but I hope that they are large enough. If not, and if you find it difficult, try and enhance the screen on your side. Other than that, please listen along and the presentation will be made available to you. Our presentation this evening won't take so long. There is not that many slides, so we can engage in your questions and answers afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to start out this evening for us. All right, so our topic for this evening, as I've already said, is the development and presentation of your master's dissertation and your doctoral thesis. In short, understanding your chapter development and the requirements for your chapter. As I said before, I'm Professor Jeanette Maritz, and I've given my contact information on this slide. So before we start with the actual chapter development, just a few things that I want to clarify and concepts that I'd like to clarify. And these are concepts that students asked in previous sessions, and so maybe just a short clarification. In previous sessions, students asked what is a, or just we'll talk about a topic versus a title, but just to clarify the words that we are using in terms of a thesis versus a dissertation, and what is the difference between the two. So in a doctoral thesis is usually in greater length and breadth and depth than a master's dissertation. And the reason for this is that it is based on original research. So that's not saying that your master's research isn't original research. It could be, but the scope of a doctoral thesis is wider. It goes into more in-depth discussions usually, and in-depth research designs and methods, and it also then culminates in a unique contribution. While the standard length of a master's dissertation is usually around 100 pages or 50,000 words, and a doctoral thesis can be upwards from 250 to even 500 pages, so around 8,000 words. So just the clarification in terms of a thesis versus a dissertation, so a doctoral thesis and a master's dissertation. Then also just briefly, students asked previously, what is the difference between a title versus a topic? So your title summarizes the main idea of your study or your research, and a good title usually contains as few words as possible that adequately describe the contents and the purpose of your research study. And that's usually not more than 15 words. So you can go back and check your titles and evaluate your titles in terms of length. The reason for the 15-word limit is for the ability to catalogue and have your titles on a database, and that's usually around 15 words. So just maybe check on that. And then a topic is your research interest, the broader research interest or your phenomena under study. So I hope that clarifies the questions around the difference between a topic and a title. So usually your title will be the heading that you have on the first page of your thesis or your dissertation. So going back to the understanding your chapter development and the requirements, the structure of a thesis or a dissertation often depends on your field of study, but there is a generic outline and that's usually divided into at least 4 or 5 chapters, and that includes an introduction and a conclusion chapter for a dissertation, or up to 6 or sometimes more for a thesis. So please take note the fields that you are in, also the colleges that you are studying with. What are their guidelines in terms of the thesis chapters and master's dissertation chapters? But there is a generic structure to most theses and dissertation. And that goes according to these following 6 outlines. And I will speak to what happens if there is more or maybe less chapters, but usually the minimum chapters is 4. And there isn't really a maximum number of chapters for a doctoral or a PhD thesis, but the generic structure in most studies is that you have a chapter 1, which is the introduction to your research study or the broad introduction as well of your topic. I'll go into greater detail for each chapter, but I just want to give you an overview of the chapter outline. So usually your chapter 1 is your introductory chapter. Chapter 2 is usually a literature review chapter, and in that chapter you survey your relevant sources, literature on the topic, and your scope that you go into regarding the current and possibly previous literature that is applicable to your topic. Chapter 3 is usually a chapter called your methodology, or sometimes also called a design and methods chapter. And we'll talk about the difference or the similarity between a methodology or design and methods. Chapter 4 is usually an overview of your results or your findings of your research. And in a few minutes, we'll talk about what's the difference between results and findings. Chapter 5 is a discussion of your results or findings and their implications. And chapter 6 is a conclusion that shows what your research has contributed. So in an outline where, for instance, you only have 4 chapters, for instance, a master's of limited scope or a purely qualitative master's study, you could have your discussion chapter or your discussion section included in your chapter 4. So if there is a 4-chapter dissertation, it's possible that the discussion is included in the results or findings chapter, but at a very minimum there would be 4 chapters. For a master's, usually there is 5, but possibly also 4. And then with a PhD, remember we said that there might be an additional chapter that relates to your originality and your original contribution to your research, and that would be additional chapter. It's also possible that you could have more than one chapter that deals with your literature review. So you could potentially have 2 chapters on your literature review, or potentially have a chapter that looks at your conceptual framework in a chapter, and then another chapter that deals with your literature review. So you can see that it's not a fixed number of chapters, but it could depend on your study. Also very important to remember is we aim to have chapters that are more or less equal in weight. And what I mean by equal in weight is that we don't want one chapter that's 10 pages and another that's 40 and another that's 70 pages. So we attempt to have more or less equal weight. So usually if I say equal weight in a master's study, it could be around 20 pages for each chapter. However, your findings chapter might be a little bit heavier, but we don't want chapters that are larger, smaller, and that vary a lot. So that might be a decision that you take with your supervisor in terms of your chapter lengths. For a PhD, you could expect that the chapters might be a bit longer, between 25 or maybe 30 pages. And that's sometimes what also informs our decision whether we want more chapters when we decide on the number of chapters and what is the weight of each chapter. So let's have a look in terms of what you could expect to have in chapter 1. Remember, we said chapter 1 is your introduction, and this chapter presents the core of your research. Very important to remember this. So I often find that once students have developed their proposal, that their proposal might become the backbone of their chapter 1. So the information and the length that you went into your discussion for your proposal is often more or less a guide that you can expect in your chapter 1. So your chapter 1 would generally start with the introduction, as each chapter would. So in your introduction, you would tell your reader, and we are writing for a reader. Now, right, in your case, on a master's dissertation level, you are writing for your examiner. So your introduction will introduce to your reader what they can expect in your study and your research. So usually we want an introduction to be catchy, to catch the reader's attention, and it will tell the reader what they can expect in this chapter. Then we might have a section called the background of the problem, but sometimes your background could be included in your introduction. So we might sometimes have a heading that says introduction and background to the study, or it could be 2 different headings. Then you have the opportunity in your chapter 1 to discuss the problem, your problem statement in the study. And this is the opportunity where you can guide your reader and tell the reader what is the problem that you are addressing. For who is it a problem? When is it a problem? How is it a problem? Why is it a problem, and why is it important to address and try and solve this problem? You will also have a heading that discusses the purpose of the study, or sometimes they call it an aim. An aim and a purpose is the same thing, but remember that when we call it an aim of the study, that you just be consistent when referring to aim. So don't have a heading that says the purpose of your study, and then you start the section by saying the aim of the study is. So very important to be congruent. You can choose either the aim or purpose, and you can also look at the guidelines of your discipline or in your school, but it could either be the aim or the purpose. So your aim and purpose is your overall overall objective in terms of what you want to reach in your study. Then it might be followed by specific objectives. So you might have a purpose, and then you might have a heading referring to the specific objectives of your study. So your objectives would be the steps that you take to achieve your purpose. Then you've got your research questions, or in a quantitative study, it might be your research hypothesis. And remember that your research questions or hypothesis needs to align with the objectives of your study. Then we come to your research design, or you might call it your research methodology. Now, a research methodology is the same as or includes your design and your methods. So you can decide whether you call it your research methodology or whether you call it your research design. And your research methodology would include your design and methods. But remember, in your introduction chapter, you will give a brief overview of the design. This is not the place where you will be discussing your design in great depth. You are just orientating your reader in this chapter. The same would go with your research methods. In this chapter, it's an overview of your chosen methods, and that includes your data collection and your data analysis. It might then also include your ethical considerations, or this might be discussed in your chapter 3 when you've got an in-depth discussion on your research design and methods. This chapter will also include the significance of your study, your definition of terms, your assumptions and delimitations. Very important, it is not the limitations. We don't discuss the limitations of a study in chapter 1, but we do discuss the delimitations in chapter 1. So in your final chapter, you will discuss the limitations of the study. So delimitation in chapter 1 tells the reader what is the boundaries of your study. So what is the contextual boundaries, for instance? What is the context of your study? It might be bounded within a specific time or space. It might be bounded within a specific design or other delimitations of your study. So just remember, that is not the limitations. Your assumptions, on the other hand, might discuss your paradigm, or your paradigm or your meta-theoretical perspective can be discussed in your chapter 3 as well. And then at the end of this chapter, you will then summarize. So that's more or less a generic outline that you could find in your chapter 1. You will see that I make a distinction between a summary and a conclusion. And I'll tell you why when we discuss the further chapters. So I usually guide my students in this chapter that you have a summary. Okay, so moving on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 provides a review of the literature. So this chapter assesses what is the current knowledge regarding or in terms of your topic, and what does current research say about your topic. So this chapter, as all chapters, will start with an introduction. You introduce the reader, what they can expect in this chapter. You give a search description. So for instance, what databases did you use? Over which period does your literature review stretch? What were your inclusion and exclusion criteria? What were the search terms that you used? So it gives a description, if you want to, in another word, is what was the methodology or the methods that you used to survey the current literature. So this chapter could have a conceptual or discuss your theoretical framework, as well then as a review of the research, or the conceptual or theoretical framework might be discussed in a separate chapter. I've also had students that discuss their conceptual or theoretical framework in their chapter 1. It's possible. If you're on a PhD and you delve deeper, it's possible that the description of your theoretical framework might be too heavy for one chapter, and that can then be moved. Or then, as the main idea of this chapter then is to present the review of your research on the topic. And this is usually then organized either by variables, if you have a quantitative study, or by the themes that you address after your literature review. So this chapter on a master's level could be a generic literature review. In a PhD, it could be a systematic review or a meta review. But this chapter usually then deals with the theoretical foundations and the research on your current topic. Then chapter 3 is your research methodology, or if you wish, you could call it your research design and methods. Again, an introduction for your reader to the chapter. What can they expect in this chapter? So this chapter then usually deals with your research design. It could just mention again your research questions or hypotheses just to orientate your reader again. It will address your population, your sample and your sampling. It would address your instrumentation, your data collection methods, your data analysis, measures of rigor, or in a qualitative study, your measures of trustworthiness, and you will end the chapter with a summary again. So in terms of the outline, more or less a generic outline. As said in chapter 1, you might include your ethical issues either in chapter 1 or in this chapter, depending on how heavy the chapter then becomes. So now we come to your chapter 4, and this chapter provides your research results or your research findings. Now, what is the difference between research results and research findings? A quantitative study usually has research results, where a qualitative study has research findings. So if you have a qualitative design, you will usually have a chapter that speaks to the research findings. If you have a quantitative study, it would usually refer to research results. So again, this chapter will have an introduction. It will then present your findings, either organized by your research questions, hypothesis, or your themes. And this chapter might have a conclusion, and either have a conclusion or a summary. But please know that there is a difference between a summary and a conclusion. You reach a conclusion after you have presented an argument and evidence and then are able to come to conclusions. So your literature review chapter can arrive at conclusions because it has an argumentative stance. You provide evidence and therefore you can reach a conclusion. And the same would go with your chapter 4, your research findings or your results. Chapter 5, if you didn't include your discussion in chapter 4 along with your findings or your results, chapter 5 would then introduce your discussion. Again, an introduction, and in this chapter you will discuss your findings or you will discuss your results in terms of in qualitative studies, we call it a literature control. And yeah, you can bring again, you can now compare and contrast your findings with previous research. So literature control simply means that you now either back to your literature review and you now compare and contrast with other studies, or you discuss your findings in greater depth. And this chapter would then end with a summary again. So if you have a PhD or you are working on a thesis, your next chapter could potentially be the chapter where your unique contribution is situated. So usually in a thesis or a doctoral thesis, you would, after you have analyzed your findings or your results, these findings will then be used to either potentially develop a model or strategies or guidelines or programs. And this chapter is then when you find where the unique contribution is usually then delivered. So this could be an additional chapter after your findings and your discussion. And then we would end with your final chapter, and that's usually called the summary, implications and outcomes. Some call it the summary, recommendations, limitations and conclusions. So the title varies to some extent in different disciplines. So just check your guidelines. But usually it also then starts with an introduction. You might give a short summary of your findings or your results. And in this chapter, very important, you will then arrive at certain conclusions. And these conclusions can be organized again according to your questions, your hypothesis, or your themes. Now, this chapter then speaks to your limitations. What were the limitations of your study? And you don't need to worry that you will be judged and found wanting if you have certain limitations. All studies have limitations. There could have been limitations in terms of your participants, your respondents, data collection, the fact that the generalization of your results, the transferability of your findings. So this chapter is the place where you would discuss your limitations. Then you could have a chapter that's or a section that provides suggestions for future research, and then there is an overall conclusion of your study and your chapter then. So there are two conclusions, but they are different. One includes questions, hypothesis, or themes. The conclusion then serves as a conclusion to the chapter and a final conclusion to your research. So that, in short, is more or less a generic outline for your chapters and your chapter development. I just want to spend some time to discuss a few other issues in terms of your chapter development. Just before we go over to that, your dissertation, other than your chapters, will also have matters such as front and back matters. Your front matters speaks to your title page, and please refer to the guidelines in your discipline or in your school, or the UNISA guidelines as to what the title page needs to look like. The UNISA has certain generic expectations of what needs to be included and how a title page is formatted. They might have a declaration. A declaration is that speaks to the honesty declaration and that you haven't plagiarized and it's original work. Then your acknowledgement section, this is optional, but usually I find that students would like to acknowledge the role players in their research and in their studies. It might contain a summary, and this summary might be in more than one language. And then your table of content all make up your front matter. And just for editing purposes, your title page usually doesn't have a page number, but the rest of the pages in your front matter are all are numbered in Roman numbers. So not 1, 2, 3, 4, but in Roman numericals. And then when you start with your actual chapters, your page numbers will commence from then onwards. Your back matter consists of your references and usually the annexures to your dissertation or your thesis. These annexures might include your ethical clearance letters, or it might also have your site permission letters, evidence of those, non-disclosure agreements, your interview guide or your instrument, transcribed interviews, for instance, the example of one for qualitative studies, also your editor's letter. So these annexures make up the evidence for to ensure an audit trial, so that your examiner can check your ethical clearance, ethical issues such as non-disclosure agreements. They can also check the original interview guides or instruments, and in a qualitative study, they can then actually read a transcribed interview. So they can check what you actually said in your methodology section, whether that rings true in your interviews, and then obviously also your editor's letters. There could be more annexures, but usually these are the main ones that you will find in the back matter. So now you know in your presentation that you would have your front matter, you will have your chapters, and you will have your back matter, and that makes up your thesis or your dissertation. So aspects that I just want to talk about other than the actual headings and chapter outline. It's very, very important that we remember that your thesis structure and your arguments need to be logically coherent and aligned. So there's a reason why the chapters are presented in the way that they are presented, because it forms part of a logical structure, a logical argument in your research story. So each part of your thesis should contribute to your argument. So the thesis structure then should support your argument, and that is why it's presented in a certain way. And your argument map can be very useful to guide you through your project. So that is the reason, for instance, why we have in a logical format, for instance, in chapter 1, that you present the background to your study. That then logically flows to the presentation of your research problem, which then logically flows to your questions, to your purpose, to your objectives, and then to the design and the methods that you will follow to answer your research questions. So it isn't just a random affair that these outlines were the way they were. It is in order to support a logical structure and an argument in terms of your research. So there are certain evaluation criteria that you can answer and evaluate your own chapters and the outline of your study. You could ask yourself and go and self-evaluate that, does my title contain the key concepts developed in the thesis or the dissertation? So you can also now look, how long is your title? Does it address the key concepts? Does it address your phenomena under study, potentially your unit of analysis? Who was the population in your study? And does this is this done within the guidelines of more or less 15 words? So very important, does your thesis or your chapters hang together? Just a nice word for saying, is it logical? Is it congruent? Does your introduction guide your reader about your research structure and as well as your aims and scope of the research? Is there a sense of argument developing in your thesis or dissertation? And do I guide my reader by making links between the different sections and subsections? Now that would also mean the different chapters. So do you guide your reader by telling them, for instance, as you move from your research background to your research question, do you make a link for your reader by linking, for instance, through a linking sentence, the different sections within your chapters? And this is the reason why we have an introduction and a summary. It helps to orientate our reader. So you will usually find at the end of a chapter in your summary, you might have a sentence or two that tells the reader what they can find in the next section. And in the beginning of the section, you might tell the reader what the previous section was and what they can now expect in this section. So it's very, very important that you take your reader's hand and you walk them through the sections. I'll give you a metaphor just now as well. And then finally, do the headings and subheadings encapsulate the meaning of the text that follows the headings and vice versa? What I mean by that is that we don't want to see that you have a heading, for instance, that speaks to your, for instance, your design of your research, but you've got a heading that says research design, but you are telling the reader, for instance, about your data analysis, or under your data analysis heading, you are discussing your data collection. So it means that there is a congruence between the heading of your section, or it could be the chapter that the relevant information is discussed under the relevant headings. So it might seem so straightforward, it might seem so taken for granted, but I often find that students have a heading and then they discuss something quite different under the heading. So please check for the congruence in terms of what you have as a heading and what you discuss under that heading. So I hope these few evaluation criteria will help you to also self-evaluate how your chapters hang together, if they discuss what they are supposed to discuss, if there's a logical flow in your chapter and between your chapters. So There are some readings that I found helpful. Henning Gravett and Rensburg is an oldish book, but it's really such simple language that helps you to understand the structuring of your thesis and your dissertation and the academic writing that goes with it. So it's very important if you're in the early stages of your dissertation or your thesis, if you are had a break in your academic career and you're only returning to your studies now, that academic writing is so critically important in every stage of your research. That it's very important. And what I like in this little book is it tells you so nicely how to structure sentences, how to link paragraphs, how to ensure that there's an argument, that there's a logical flow. And because it's an older book, it's not that expensive, and you can find it on Take-A-Lot or Macro or any of these sites. So it's just, for me, a South African book, easy reading if you wanted some guidance in terms of your academic writing to develop arguments and to ensure logical writing. Then for those of you on a PhD trajectory, very nice, also South African book is the book by Latius Lategan from Sun Media, and it's called Get Ready, Get Set, Get Go, Preparing for Your Doctoral Studies and Your Doctoral Education. And I've just given you you can, if you've got a smartphone, you can just go on the code there, and it will take you to the book. It helps you to get an overview of what is expected in a doctoral thesis, what you need to have in place, also some broader issues in terms of your doctoral journey. So I just wanted to give you some examples of books that's not so expensive, or they might be available in the library as well, but that can help you along in your journey in terms of structuring, developing your chapters and the requirements that go along with those. So I said that this wasn't going to be a very long presentation. And I want to tell you that you need to enjoy the journey, not just the destination. We always so focused to get this done with. But this is a journey of a number of years, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So I really hope that you enjoy the journey as well as the destination. If you're just starting with your studies, that you also enjoy this early stages where you start conceptualizing your research and that you start conceptualizing your larger study and the journey that goes along with that. So with that, my presentation is done. I'm going to stop sharing that aspect, and I am going to go to the question and answer session. I'm just waiting for the published questions, and let's just start with where they start. I'm going to share my camera again so that we can just have a more intimate discussion again. So here I am again. So thank you for the slides, for the presentation, and there's a question. Could I repeat the discussion on assumptions and delimitations? Sure, I'm happy to do that. So within our studies, when we talk just about the assumptions of our study, our assumptions are usually found within the research paradigm that we might ascribe to. So please don't get scared when we talk about paradigms, but our paradigm is our beliefs about our research that we are following. So If you are using a qualitative research design, your paradigm might be positivism, and positivism has certain assumptions. So they might, the assumptions in positivism might be in terms of their view about the world. Positivists believe that you can measure the world, that there is a specific reality and we can measure that. Now, that is a research assumption. There's a number of other assumptions as well. So this is often where the heavy words such as epistemology, ontology, axiology comes in. But it simply means it is your worldview. If you are working within a qualitative design, you might work within a paradigm of constructivism or interpretivism, and they have certain assumptions about the world and about how research is done. So this section is often where we can speak to our assumptions or our paradigm or the assumptions we hold for our research. Our delimitations is not the same as our limitations that we have in our final chapter. Our delimitation refers to what is the boundedness of our study. So you, for instance, might only be looking at a certain population within a certain district. And that might be the boundedness of your study. So, for instance, your research might only look at health users in the rural districts of Polokwane, for instance. So that is a boundedness of your study, the location or the context in which your study takes place. It might be bounded within a certain time. So, for instance, the study took place between 2020 and 2023. That's the boundedness in terms of the time that the study took place. It could be bounded in terms of your research design. For instance, this was a qualitative study. So my results is not generalizable, but they are transferable. So there might be boundedness in terms of your research design and what that can deliver. So I hope that gives you some ideas in terms of delimitation. So it's not a negative term. It simply tells your reader what are the boundaries of your study. When did it take place? In what boundedness? And that is your delimitations of the study. Where at the end of your study, you would have your limitations. And that would be things, for instance, what you could achieve or you couldn't achieve. What were potential challenges that you had? And that would speak to limitations of the study. I hope that makes it a bit more clear. Is prepositions included in the word count of a research title? Yes. Okay, but so be very careful with the use. But yes, words are every single word that you use, and that would include. So be very selective in terms of making sure that you really need every word that you need, and it's quite a skill to get it down to 15 words. So the next question, I knew I would be challenged around this. Would I be penalized if the title is 18 or 19 words? No, I can't say that you will be penalized, but try and see if you can maybe get it down to around 15 or so. So parsimony is usually what they refer to. Make sure that you use your words sparingly and that you really need every single word that you are using. Is it necessary or compulsory to include an abstract at master's level? It usually is, because remember, your abstract is also what will be used when your dissertation or your thesis is uploaded to the UNISA repository. So an abstract is usually, I said it's optional, but if you look at the UNISA guidelines, request that you have an abstract. So please look at not just your department or your school's guidelines, but also look at the guidelines from UNISA. And you will find that on the documents in the UNISA or on your My UNISA, for instance, as well. So please have a look at what is the university's requirements, and also your department's. But generally, yes, an abstract is required by the university. Whether at one stage the university required that the abstract be translated in one other language other than just English. I still require my students to do that, but I don't know if they strictly enforce the requirements that the abstract be translated. All right, so Anonymous said that thank you, the assumptions and the limitations are now clear. Okay, so it seems that we're at the end of the questions. I will hold on for a minute or two and just see if there's maybe any other questions. Otherwise, I hope that the presentation gave you an outline of how you would go about to structure your thesis or your dissertation, and more or less what is expected in the chapters. Thank you so much for being present, and doesn't seem as if there's any other questions. So from my side, I wish you a positive journey, and that you've got some more clarity in terms of how you develop your thesis outline or your dissertation. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.